Hello, Dice Tower friends. Welcome to another daily chat. I apologize in advance for this harsh, here we go, this side, this harsh glow that I've got emanating. This room is not necessarily the best for doing this, but we're making the best of the situation as we all have been. And so thank you for coming to chat with us again, and I'm definitely looking forward to this. This is with the highlights of my week are doing these daily chats, and it's especially lovely tonight because we have a very special guest, and it's not night where our guest is. And this is Mr. Ian O'Toole. Ian, welcome to the Dice Tower Daily Chat. It is lovely to see you.
Hey, Mike. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And, you know, this is interesting. I usually talk a little bit with the guest before we get to our first question, but our first question is about our guest. So Cora Lou asks, hello, everyone. Anyone know who Ian O'Toole, the guest today, is? And I know. And the thing is, I think most board gamers, whether they know you by name, they are familiar with your work. So why don't you tell everybody who you are?
Sure. Hello, everybody. I am a graphic designer and an illustrator who works in board games. I've worked on many games, probably most known for Vital Lacerda's games, such as Lisboa and The Gallerist and Venus and On Mars and Escape Plan. And I'm probably forgetting one, at least, CO2. Black Angel last year. Lots of other games. Nemo's War, which seems to be getting quite popular at the moment.
It's funny you say that, actually. Nemo's War has been a game that I've championed for a long time, and not just because of the fantastic job you did, because that was a second edition, right, that you did the artwork for. Yes. You know, that's been a game that myself and a lot of other solo gamers have talked about. And now that a lot more people are kind of partaking of solo gaming experiences, they're staying in, that's one that I always recommend. And it certainly doesn't hurt that it looks gorgeous. So, yes, Ian is responsible for you did the graphic design and...
Yeah, for most of those games, I did everything that you see visually. So the graphic design, the illustration, sometimes the component design. Like I designed the little Nautilus miniature in Nemo's War, for instance.
Nice.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's interesting because I've been a fan of Ian's for a long time, and also had him on our podcast that Dan and I do. And one of the things that we talked about there, and I just figured maybe if you wanted to talk about that for a second, is we had kind of asked you about the difference between being an artist and being an illustrator, because at least at the time that and it's been probably close to a year since we had you on the podcast, you were saying at that time, if I remember correctly, that you don't consider yourself an artist necessarily, you consider yourself more of an illustrator, and maybe what the difference is there.
Sure, that's a bit of a rabbit hole.
I know.
The difference between an artist and an illustrator has a brief basically a set of criteria that they need to achieve. Illustration is commercial art, basically.
Right.
And art can be commercial as well in many ways, but illustration is, I guess it has more of a specific job to do.
Yeah, and you know,
makes sense.
Right. And a lot of times I hear when there's criticisms oftentimes of quote unquote art in board games, one of the criticisms I hear is that, well, it's beautiful, but it's not necessarily very functional. Like the board is too busy. It's gorgeous, but I can't really see where the spaces are, or things aren't delineated as much as I would like. And I guess that might be where being an illustrator or a graphic designer, that sensibility would maybe take over more than even that. You might even rein in some of the quote unquote artistic mindset that you'd have.
Yeah. That's mostly, I think, a graphic design concern that you're talking about. So lack of legibility and lack of readability in the board. It can also be an illustrative thing as well. It's it's quite common that the illustrator and the graphic designer are two different people.
Mm-hmm.
So when that's the case, they really have to work together quite closely, I think, to achieve a good result. Or you've got somebody in the middle who's usually an art director, who kind of is the center point for those two skills, and they are often the person who will have the overarching sort of vision for the project.
Right.
And they will, coordinate between a graphic designer and illustrator, sometimes multiple illustrators.
However, you're a one-stop shop, am I right? I mean, you pretty much you got to take care of all that, don't you?
Yes, I do. Yeah, I do both. So yeah, it's obviously a little easier for me to manage because it's just me.
Sure.
Yeah. So I tend to develop the two in conjunction. So at the same, I tend to develop the illustration and the graphic design at the same time. I usually lead with graphic design because I think ultimately it's more important in a board game scenario.
Okay.
But I'm conscious of the two, as I'm developing both at the same time.
Okay. Yeah. We have a comment from Paul Tompkins. The cover of Irish Gauge is beautiful. I would also agree with that. Now, the follow-up to that is coming out now or soon, isn't it? You also did the artwork on that. Is it Ride the Rails? Is that right?
Yeah, it's the second Iron Rails. The Iron Rails series from Capstone, yeah. I'm not certain when it's coming out. I think it's Origins.
Sure. So if Origins happens, then it would be there. Otherwise,
and
depending.
If not, sure, it'll just not at Origins,
Sure. Speaking of the Irish Gauge and Ride the Rails, those to me almost have more of a graphic design sensibility to them. If I don't know if I'm explaining that well, but just the covers themselves have almost more of an. And I hope this isn't. If this is a pejorative thing amongst artists, then I apologize. But it almost has kind of that art, the advertisement, the Art Deco almost feel to it. Am I completely off the rails?
No. It's very much a sort of printmaking approach.
Right. That's what I was kind of struggling for.
Which is pretty popular in advertising in the sort of 40s, 50s, thereabouts. So yeah, just using sort of flat colors and that's almost a screen printing type of effect.
Right.
So is that a graphic design approach? I don't know. Sometimes it's hard for me to tell because sometimes I don't consciously separate the two. I guess there's a strong emphasis on composition, but that's not necessarily a graphic design thing. That's an illustration thing as well. So composition is the arrangement of elements and shapes and darks and lights, so it looks pleasing and leads the eye where it wants to go, and all that sort of stuff. Looks balanced and so I guess from that point of view, it can look quite graphic, if not graphic designy. Sure.
No, I'm just making stuff up, Ian. I mean, you don't have to follow down my nonsense, but
I mean, the composition is quite graphic because you do have the train is at the bottom. It's in portrait. It's just going across the bottom of the composition, and then you've got the landscape behind it, which is kind of in flat planes arranged.
Right.
So yeah, I guess that is quite a graphic approach to it.
Well, thank you for humoring me, even if I'm just speaking nonsense. Jerry D has a very simple question. Where is Ian from?
I am from Wicklow in Ireland, but I currently live in Perth in Western Australia, and have done for the last 12 years, 13, maybe 14. I don't know. Oh wow!
Fantastic. That's both places I would love to visit someday. Have not been to either, but I would very much love to visit.
So Irish Gauge the cover of Irish Gauge is loosely based on the landscapes of the Wicklow Mountains.
Oh.
Very loosely, I would say.
Very nice. Very nice. Kabuki Kid, who is an all-star, a Dice Tower chat all-star. Kabuki Kid is everywhere. I don't know that Kabuki ever sleeps. Do you have, and I know this is probably that you get the questions like this quite a bit. Do you have anything coming out soon that you can talk about or elaborate on? Anything that maybe you're excited about that's been announced?
Yes. So the new edition of Kanban is coming out.
That looks
Kanban
gorgeous.
is on its way. The new edition of Rococo is on its way.
Also looks gorgeous.
Thank you. I have a game called Merv for Osprey Games, which they've just released a cover of.
Okay.
Don't know how much I can say about that besides that, because I don't think they've done a press release, but that's on its way. That is by the designer of Kalamala and Ragusa.
Oh, okay. I think I've seen the cover for that.
Yeah, it's a really nice game actually. There is. I have Dead Reckoning coming from AEG.
Okay.
Which is John D. Clare. So that's using the card crafting system.
Have you worked with AEG before?
No.
I hadn't thought so. Okay.
No, we've circled a few times. But,
sure.
No, we've never. This is the first project. So that's been really good. That's a sort of privateer, pirate themed high seas adventure game with the card crafting system. So there's a lot of customizing your crew and all that sort of stuff. So that's been fun. That is going to be crowdfunding sometime shortly in the future.
Sure.
I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, I got you.
It's on its way though. There's other stuff.
Sure.
In the pipeline.
Those are the things you feel comfortable discussing. You talked about a couple of these games saying, "Oh, it's a nice game. It's a nice game," and so that implies that you've played the game maybe in various stages of development, and so. Is that always the case? Has there ever been a time where you've done some graphic design or art for a game that you haven't actually played through? Or is that even possible because you're so involved with maybe the layout of the board or the components or cards, things along those lines?
I'm trying to think. It's very rare if it has happened.
You know what? I stole Beth's question. I'm sorry. I don't mean to cut you off, but she asked questions for Ian from Beth Burns. Do you play through the games before you do the art? Almost as if she was reading my mind. Do you generally do the graphic design as well as the art?
I always try and play the games. If I always do, I'm pretty sure. It's very much part of the process. If it's a very, very simple small game, which I don't do a huge amount of, then sometimes I'll just play it myself. I'll just kind of two-handed or whatever. But I always make a prototype. I always put it on the table. Okay. Or I'm sent a prototype, or one or the other.
Sure.
And this is the designer's prototype usually. And then I always play it. For most games, I'll try and play through at least one full game with other players at the table, especially if it's a big game. For some of Vital's games, obviously, I need to play through the whole thing. I also play it with him on Tabletopia. But yeah, that's a really important part of the process because first of all, I need to understand the game. Otherwise, I can't do my job. I don't think. And secondly, there's a part of the work I do is taking the designer's prototype and reinterpreting it. So it's not just making it look nice and putting icons on it and pictures and things like that.
Sure.
I'll actually think about if there's a better way that the game could work, if we want to take it apart and put it back together again, if we need player boards or player aids, if there's a lot of tokens, can we simplify it? Can we make it a track? All this sort of stuff. Can we move things around to emphasize the important parts of the game on the board, and also make relationships between different areas more apparent so that learning the game is more intuitive? Are there ways that we can save on setup time? All of these different things are sort of part of the early work that I do, which is before I do any drawing or icons or any of that sort of stuff.
Sure.
So I really like that. It's a really fun part of the process because it's really quick and it's open. It's asking sort of big sweeping questions.
Right. And it's yeah, kind of usability. And you are speaking my language when you talk about this stuff, because some of my biggest complaints when it comes to games in general is oftentimes I'll be playing a game and I'll be thinking, man, I really wish that they would have put this on a track. You know what I mean? Right. Other than having 25 different tokens. It seems like so often there are ways that you can simplify the process for the gamer to make the game easier for the gamer to play, so that they're concentrating on the experience. They're not getting sucked out of the immersion because they're fiddling with little bits here or there. Right. And so I love to hear that this is such a big consideration, because especially a lot of the games that you do are quite complex, at least the ones that you're probably most well known for, Lacerda's games being paramount amongst those. I've got to think the amount of work that's involved on the front end of that, trying to figure out the UI, when you've got the kind of the hallmark of Vital's games are the interlocking cogs, all the pieces working together. And I would think that to make that work in a way that is somewhat elegant, it's got to be very, very difficult, and a lot of work on the front end.
Yeah, it is. It can be a lot of work. I really enjoy it, though. It's really good. Vital is also quite organized in his prototypes, more than a lot of designers. Vital is a graphic designer himself. I
didn't know that.
He doesn't do. Yeah, he worked in advertising for quite a while.
Okay.
So he doesn't go too far into like iconography design and so he does a little bit.
Okay.
But his prototypes tend to be at least neat.
Sure.
They're not post-it notes and hand-drawn. So that's really helpful. And he's also, as you might expect from his designs, he's quite organized in his thinking.
You don't say.
Yeah.
Yeah, that does not surprise me in the least.
Yeah, but still, there's things that I always end up sort of shifting around to a greater or lesser degree. I think on Mars, for instance, didn't change a whole lot. The general layout of the board didn't change a huge amount. Lisboa changed considerably. Lisboa probably changed the most out of any of them.
Okay.
So it really depends,
Right.
Also depends on the designer as well. Sometimes the board will make sense in how it's been laid out, and some designers have a knack for that, and maybe through playtesting they've gotten feedback on how even if they don't know why, there's just people have told them, this shouldn't be there, or I can't find this when I'm looking for it or whatever.
Right.
And then some designers, and that's fine, just don't have a knack for doing that.
Sure.
So it's a bit messy, and that's all fine. But it's a really fun part of the process.
Well, I'm glad you enjoy it, because let me tell you, that's something that I think needs to happen a bit more. Really quickly, I see Kabuki Kid is saying there's a low level but high-pitched buzzing. I apologize. It may have something to do with the gain on my mic. I'm going to try to adjust it a little bit. So I'll look in the chats. If it looks like it's getting better or worse, let me know. I'm just adjusting. Pay no attention. I'm adjusting the gain a little bit. We'll see if that helps.
Okay.
I apologize. Apparently, someone says that it's my rad liquid cooling. It's not. I don't have. I wish I had liquid cooling. I'm assuming that's something good. I'm assuming I know what that means. Okay. Let's see here. Man, Kabuki's got all the questions, but they're good. Let's see here. All right, Kabuki, another one. What's a game you would like to do art for? Maybe something a game theme, sorry, you would like to do art for. Maybe something you've never done before. Is there a particular theme that you think would be intriguing to you that you haven't had a chance to do or haven't done as much as you'd like?
Yeah, there's probably a few. I'm a big horror fan, so I'd love to do a horror game. I'd specifically love to do like a haunted house style game. I think that would be really nice to do. I would love to do a ancient Rome game. Rome or Greece.
Actually. Okay.
Yeah, actually, probably more ancient Greece. to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to do a World War One game.
Okay.
And I would love to do a game based on the sort of golden age of sail. I've kind of done that a little bit with Nemo's War, but
Sure.
just a little bit more. I'm a big fan of nautical paintings and stuff like that.
Me too. Me too. That's something I when I see something that has that kind of underwater or nautical theme, I'm going to pay attention no matter what. Now, it might not be a very good game, and my attention may sway, but that's always going to get my attention. And I'm still working on that game, Kabuki. I'm turning it the wrong way. Look, I'm not saying I'm technically savvy. Please, I've never ever made that claim. I'm just trying to make it happen. I'm sorry. Okay, let's see here. Okay. Jerry D asks, Ian, is there a person or people you can name that you're similar to your style, or maybe that you get inspiration from?
Oh wow. Similar to my style. I don't know. I'm a little bit blind towards my own style, to be honest. People see more consistency in my style than I do. I think I have a consistent approach, but I think the outcome is often very different. So
sure,
that's a little difficult. So I definitely have games and projects that I've worked on that are in very different styles, and those individual styles would be influenced by a lot of different artists. In fact, that's one of the things that I really like about jumping around in styles, is that each game I can look at it and go, well, what sort of style do I want to play in? What are the things that I really like? Black Angel was a great example, because I'm a big fan of lots of sort of classic 60s and 70s sci-fi illustrators.
Sure.
So that's not something that I can really bring to bear on Lisboa, for instance, or something like that. So that gives me the opportunity through the theme to sort of draw on all these other people that really inspire me. So as regards my style, not particularly, but certainly from different games, and it's sometimes it's specific artists. It's rarely one specific artist. In fact, I don't think it ever is. It's more like an era of illustration or something. Nemo's War was based on the sort of the old adventure story.
Sure.
Joseph Clement Cole and J. Allen St. John and all these different classic adventure story illustrators. Whereas what else? What other games have I done? Escape Plan, for instance, is kind of based on those heist movie posters from, not quite like Bullet and stuff like that, but that era of poster design and stuff, and that's the cover more than anything.
Sure.
So yeah, I certainly jump around in different in different styles like that, and I've got a lot of like different styles of illustration that I'm a big fan of, and part, it's kind of related to the last question. Part of what gets me excited about a project is I'll go, oh, I can work within that style that I really love. So there's like nautical illustrations or something like that. That would get me excited. I really like paintings of World War One planes and pipe, stuff like that.
Sure.
So if that was a game that came along, I would kind of get excited about that, just because of I haven't done that yet, and I'd be able to dive headlong into that.
Yeah, it sounds like there maybe like historical games would be, or even war games, but. And boy, I'm going to get myself in trouble here, but I'll dive into the breach. It does seem like those historical or war-themed games don't always get maybe the same attention when it comes to the aesthetics. Maybe it's a bit more of a, and it might be a usability thing. It might be because of the style of those style of games, you don't quite have the ability to have quite the same artistic latitude you might otherwise. I don't know.
Yeah. That's hard to say.
Yeah.
A little bit. I think there are some, the games that tend to get the most flack would be war games and like 18xx, that style again.
Sure.
I think there are some war games that are beautiful to look at and beautiful to play. That would probably, I think, fair to say, be the exception.
Mm-hmm.
But there certainly are some, and I think some war games, while not aesthetically pleasing, are very usable.
Right, that's true.
I think there's maybe a little bit of a tendency, both in less and less so in both camps, I think, but in 18xx style games, and in war games, to think that aesthetics and usability are two ends of a spectrum, and you got to choose one, as opposed to aesthetics and usability working together and combining. I think there's a danger that people think that if you want to make a game look nice and pleasing, then it has to have lots of illustration all over it.
Sure.
It has to have trees and mountains on the map and rivers and things, and then that leads to things being confusing, and the usability drops. And that's not necessarily the case. A clean, usable design with good typography will just in itself look very aesthetically pleasing and still be very, very usable. In fact, still be more usable. Because the one thing that's consistent about, consistently that I see as a failing of war games and those types of things, and again, sweeping generalizations here, is the use of typography.
Okay.
Specifically, I think a lot of times, good, clean typography could make things a lot clearer, a lot more readable, a lot more usable. Particularly when you're looking at little counters and all these types of things. Yeah,
we were doing a crowd surfing segment this Wednesday, and there was a war game that was one of the things that are up on Kickstarter, and it seemed like they were taking these. I can't tell you what point font. I mean, negative integers, negative 0.5 font. I mean, this was just ridiculously small. Now, granted, I have old man eyes, but even in my best days, it seemed, I joked that it looked like they put the rule book on one of the sides of the die because they were like cramming. You have to have some sense of usability for a player. I mean, or you're just doing yourself a disservice. So,
yeah.
Here's a question from Hoser40K. And this may have a range here, but average length of time you spend on a project from start to finish?
Oh, man. Anywhere from 2 weeks, which would be rare.
Right.
God. Okay, so average is the question. Probably about 4 months.
Okay.
Would be average.
Okay.
I think, yeah, thereabouts.
So Lisboa was the 2-week one, right?
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah, in and out.
Yeah, that one looks like you just did that in your sleep.
Yeah, that's right.
All right, man, Kabuki. The questions are good. Is there a food that you love that you cannot easily get in Australia? Any that you discovered from being in Australia?
Food that I love that I cannot get in Australia.
Not easily, anyway.
Wow. Not really. When we arrived, it was really hard to get pork sausages.
Oh, okay.
Which is a very Irish thing. Sausages over here are beef or chicken, which is bizarre. But that's changed. We can get them now. The one thing that I can't get here, which I actually made yesterday, joining the rest of the world in making bread, is soda bread. Irish soda bread. Ah,
yeah. Do love me some soda bread.
Yeah, that's a staple of any Irish diet, is some soda bread. So that it's not really a thing here. So I've started to make my own.
Aha. So are you going to put, is it Marmite? Are you going to put Marmite on your soda bread or?
No.
No? Not going to bridge the two worlds?
It's Vegemite.
Oh, Vegemite. I look.
And the answer is also no.
Not your thing. That's not something you discovered from being in Australia. You're not a big fan of
Well, it
Vegemite.
is something I discovered, yeah, but just not in a positive sense.
Right.
As regards food that I discovered since I came over here, not really. There's seafood is really good here.
That makes sense.
I mean, seafood is good in Ireland as well, but
Sure.
just different types of seafood. So yeah, seafood. It's not that I discovered it, but I've been enjoying the seafood.
Yes, it's. I would imagine it's quite good there.
Yeah.
Wayne Kruger, and this question may sound a little familiar because I think Dan and I might have asked you a version of this question when you were on the podcast, but I like the question, and so I want to ask you again. What is a game you didn't do the art for that you would love to try to do a version of?
I would. So, Castles of Burgundy is one.
Yeah, I think that's what you. Yeah, that's what you mentioned before, and I may have gone on a 20-minute rant about that I won't reproduce here. But yes.
Yeah, I would, and that's mostly because I really like the game, and if games that I play a lot, I tend to turn them over in my head and think about how I would do things differently and
Sure.
all that sort of thing. And I think there's a different way to present that game that would be.
Oh, there's a different way. There's a different way.
I'm actually not like I know that game gets a lot of flack and whatever. I haven't even seen the new version in person. I actually think the game is fairly usable. I mean, colorblindness is a big issue with
Sure.
it. It's certainly quite muddy in its appearance, and
just a touch brown.
And for me, it's really the integration between illustration and graphic design is where that game design falls down, because on the board they've kind of just put an illustration behind it and faded it back, and then just put the game on top. So there's no integration. So I'd like to see that, and I think it could help with teaching the game. I think it could help with, God forbid, the theme of the game. Things like that. I just think there's more that could be done in that regard. And I love the game, so that kind of helps me be interested in it.
Sure.
Other than that, God, I don't know. I mean, I'd like to do a Glory to Rome.
Yeah. Glory to Rome would be nice too, wouldn't it?
Yeah. And again, Glory to Rome has a nice edition, but
sure,
you can't get it.
Yeah, the black box edition. You think that's a good edition of the I'm sure it's the best edition. I mean,
yeah, I think it's by far the best edition.
I mean, you're comparing it to the Cambridge edition, right? So I don't think that your bar is terribly high. If I can speak candidly.
Right. I do know some people who prefer it, but I think
really?
They're just contrary.
Yeah,
they're contrarians, to be honest.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
All right, so Cameron Zafar asks, Ian, would you ever like to do artwork for a computer game? Have you ever done artwork for a computer game? I guess would be another question.
No, I have not. Would I like to do artwork for a computer game? Yeah, I suppose so. I'm not a huge video gamer these days. I used to be. And then, I discovered board games. I had kids, and all my other hobbies kind of dropped away. But recently I've started playing a little bit more, but really it's just in between things. But I still I'm interested. I still listen to video game podcasts, and I still have a broad idea of what's going on. I did work on Hand of Fate, which is a board game that's based on a video game.
Okay.
So it's not quite the same, but that was me reinterpreting artwork and also working with their Illustrator. That was, from a video game, taking the interface elements from a video game, applying them to cards. That was a kind of a weird situation because the video game was a card game essentially.
Okay.
So
just in a video format, basically.
Right. Yeah. It wasn't in any way like Hearthstone in gameplay, but that sort of thing. Like,
right. Gotcha.
A card game in a video game that I then had to reinterpret back to a card game.
Okay.
So that was interesting. So that's kind of related, but not quite the same. But yeah, I'd be open to working in video games.
All right. We'll put it out there. Ian O'Toole, if you the guy's got some skills. All right. Paul Tompkins asks, what is your favorite board game art that you didn't create?
That would probably be the Grizzled.
Oh yeah, yeah. That's
Yeah.
and the whole story behind that as well, of course.
Right.
But
Sure. Yeah, the Grizzled is amazing. It's quite distinctive.
mhm.
It also it does a very difficult thing, and the game design does a very difficult thing as well. It hits a very precise tone
It really
that works
does.
just beautifully for that. It's not it's artwork that has a lot of empathy to it.
Mhm.
It's not gritty or dark, and yet it's quite warm. It's quite human.
Mhm.
It's lovely. It's lovely. It's a lovely artwork about a horrible thing.
It is.
So it hits this, but it also it evokes the core theme of the game, which is friendship and companionship
Right.
and all that sort of stuff. It's really lovely. It's very special, I think.
That's a really good point because that game, being with the subject matter the way that it is, the art does such a good job of conveying because there's still gravitas, right? The art still conveys the gravitas, but like you said, it also has the warmth and the humanity that
Yeah.
which is it's essentially a cooperative limited information game, but
Right.
it turns into so much more
Yes,
because
it
of the
does, yeah.
theme primarily, but that theme only is carried really through that art.
Yeah, it very much is. Yeah.
So yeah,
It's,
I'm with you on that. I think that the art really is what makes that game work. Mechanically it's
Yep.
a fine game, but to put that theme on it, you needed to have art that really carried that through.
Yeah.
All right.
I agree.
Now I'm going to assume this is Halo X30. Have you ever thought about releasing an art book with your game art, or is that impossible because of rights?
No, I've never thought about it until now. Would it be possible? It would require permission
Sure.
so it may or may not be possible, I suppose, is the answer to that. No, I've never really thought about it. I don't imagine there would be any demand for that sort of thing. Yeah, and I know, but I mean, the work is so specific
Sure.
to games. I mean, look, the cover artwork is kind of, you can take that and look at it by itself, but most of the artwork, and I think most of where I do my best work is in the design of components and stuff like that. And I think to take that out of context and put it in a book, I don't know. I don't know if there would be much to that. It's meant to
Right.
exist on a. It's kind of like looking at a book of sculptures, and that's
Yeah,
fine.
Sure.
You can look at a book of sculptures, but you can't walk around it and you can't
Right.
get a sense of the scale and all that sort of stuff. So, not that my games are sculptures, but
No, but I think I get your point. And that's an interesting idea too. In that I think a lot of times when people think about something like that, they're maybe thinking of those covers. But that's just one aspect. Now, it might be the most forward-facing aspect, just because that's the first thing that a consumer is going to see. And it may be something that people that don't even buy the game are still going to be a consumer of that cover. They're going to see it.
Right.
But it might be a bit out of context with the rest of the game. I mean, there are plenty of times where the art on the cover is not necessarily even indicative of the art within the rest of the game, or the components, or the player boards, or the rule book,
Right.
even for that matter. It might be just a standalone piece of art that's trying to
Yes.
convey a feeling, or who knows what the case may be. But
Yes. Yeah. I always try as much as possible to make all of that cohesive.
sure.
And I always, if I can, and it's usually not the case, but if I can, I actually try and do the cover last.
Interesting.
Yeah, the reason for that is the cover is functional and has a function and has to perform, do its job.
Sure.
But it has far less constraints on it than a board. It doesn't have any gameplay
Right.
elements that need to go on it. And to me, the elements of gameplay and design and layout are the most important thing in a board game project.
Mm-hmm.
So I tend to like to have it led by that.
Mm-hmm.
So I like to do the iconography and the board and all of that first, and then when that's done, I look at a way that I can make the cover work with that and emphasize it and reflect it.
Mm-hmm.
But be its own thing. If I do the cover first, and again, this does happen because of marketing concerns, publishers want to
Sure.
get a cover out there. If I do the cover first, then it almost feels slightly to be working backwards for me, because I'm making decisions based on style without having made other important decisions.
Right.
It's fine either way, to be honest, but it's just my preference would be to do it cover last.
Gotcha. Okay. Gator Dave asks, Mike, do you have any artistic outlets or passions? Not really. I used to like to sketch and draw, but I never felt like I had. This is a cop-out, because if you say, I never felt I had any real talent for it, well, that's baloney, I believe. I think that there are some people that are maybe savants. Maybe they're born with some real genuine artistic talent, whatever the medium might be. I'm sure that those people exist. But I would argue, and I don't know if Ian, you agree with me or not, that the vast majority of people that are very good at an artistic endeavor, it's because they've worked at it. They've worked at it for years and years and years, and they've become good. They may have had some talent that they fostered, but I think it's much more sweat equity than anything else. And I have not put in the time, quite honestly, into doing a lot of artistic outlets, whether it's, drawing or painting or even music for that matter. All things that I have an interest in and would love to say that I do, but I just don't. Haven't put in the time. So. Yeah,
I think for the most part, there are obviously your child savants and things like that.
Sure.
But I think for the most part, when people say talent, what they actually mean is somebody who has a greater desire to pursue whatever it is. I think that's what talent is. I think it's just perseverance more than anything.
Right.
I certainly, speaking for myself, I don't particularly feel like I have any sort of inherent leg up on anybody else in what I do, besides the fact that I want to do it.
Right.
And I'm willing to just put the work in and do it.
And you spent years at it.
Yeah. I've never felt that I never felt that if I stopped practicing and working at it, I would still be able to do it to the same level. It's not. It doesn't work. At least for me, it doesn't work that way.
All right. Cora Lou asks, what are some challenges like enabling colorblind players that you have to consider? I'm assuming like in that iterative process of putting a game together.
Well, color blindness is a challenge. It's a challenge because there are multiple things to consider. So, especially in Euro games, which is where I tend to work, you've typically got player colors, you've typically got resource colors, and you might have some other colors. You might have areas on the board or something like that. And ideally, all of those need to be unique or only related to each other if they're meant to be related to each other. So, the old thing about we've got a yellow player and we've got yellow resource cubes, but they're not related. So I want to get away from that. I think broadly, games have gotten away from that. That's an old-fashioned thing to see, I think, for the most part. That can be tricky because there aren't, especially when you get into the less common forms of color blindness, trying to be sort of as inclusive as possible.
Sure.
Your options, just slowly narrow down.
Right.
So sometimes it can be a case where, we look at people who are not colorblind. We look at the non-colorblind spectrum, and we come up with, colors that work. And then for the colorblind spectrum, we will look at, player colors absolutely need to be colorblind friendly, distinctive from each other.
Sure.
And then resources absolutely need to be distinctive from each other. and we might make some compromises on the fact that, well, okay, if this 10% of the population has this type of color blindness, maybe the green player looks like the blue resource, but that's actually not an issue because they don't interact in any way.
Gotcha.
It's not a big issue. It's something
Sure.
we'd rather avoid, but sometimes it's impossible. So that's something, and also, there are lots of different ways to complement colorblind friendliness. If we can use icons or screen prints and stuff like that, if possible. It's not always possible. So that's a very tricky thing. That's actually become one of the first things that we usually work on in a game is the colors.
Right.
Because that is the case with with Lisboa and on Mars. Any game that has an overall distinctive color
dominant color. Yeah.
Yeah. Lisboa, it was obvious that there wasn't going to be a blue player because the board is blue. And with On Mars, we didn't want to have an orange player because the board is mostly orange. So that's something that we knew from the start. Well, actually, On Mars it happened a little bit later, but so we need to nail down those colors because then that informs everything else.
Sure.
In the design. That's a very important thing. Other than that, there are lots of little things. I mean, it sounds silly, but things have to fit in the box.
Yeah, no, it's not silly. Any of us who have struggled to cram pieces into a box would say that is not silly at all.
Yeah, so you got to work in confines of board sizes, obviously, but also table sizes.
Sure.
And this does become with the bigger games, it does become an issue where we have to think, is this going to fit on people's tables? Yeah,
right.
And sometimes we push it.
Yeah. Looking at you, Vital, some of those games are huge.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. So they're all sort of they're all things to take into consideration.
Sure. Got it.
Yeah.
All right. Mike Poirier, Poirier, Poirier. I'm gonna look. I'm probably not even in the ballpark. Any thoughts about Viscounts of the West Kingdom now that the Kickstarter is over? Excited? Like the series? Like the bizarre artwork? Well, I'm hugely excited because I'm a big fan of Shem's games, and he's been working with S.J. McDonald on these last few. So I'm very excited. I also. I know a lot of people think that the Miko's artwork is bizarre. That tends to be a word that's used a lot with his artwork. I just find it kind of whimsical. I don't necessarily find it bizarre myself, but I personally am very excited. I love Raiders of the North Sea. I love Architects of West Kingdom, Paladin. So I'm definitely into this. Have you played any of those games?
No, I have not. I've seen them and I've walked by them a few times, but I've actually not sat down and played any of them. So I need to.
Yeah, they're lovely.
But I have not. I think he's done a really, really solid job with being being brand led.
Yes.
The branding of his games is really solid, and that comes down to the choice of the illustrator and the consistency of the illustrator, the consistency of design on the covers, the box sizes.
Yes.
Not nice neat box sizes,
right.
And also the fact that he's got sort of series of games.
Correct.
These trilogies of games. So he's done I think it's a very clever thing to do, and it's a very strong brand building exercise. He's done a really good job. But yeah, I've yet to play any of the games.
Yeah, and I agree. There's a similar thing like you'll see with a lot of the Stonemaier games, which is that even the iconography is similar enough across the board where you can, if you've played a few of these games, you can get a sense just because there's similar icons that are being used. So I agree with you on that on that branding. Here's an interesting question from Hoser40K. Any good Easter eggs hiding in your board game art? Do you sneak any little fun things in there, or?
It's not something I do all as a matter of So it's not something that I do all the time. I'm sure I have at some point. Let me think. Oh my god. I mean, the Gallerist is technically, I guess, full of Easter eggs because a lot of that artwork, a lot of it was submissions by gamers, but a lot I basically had to fill in all the gaps.
Gotcha.
So a lot of that is creative crops of other pieces that they're all my pieces.
Sure.
They're, they're not created for the gallerist.
Gotcha.
They're this kind of looks like a piece of art.
Yeah, hey, art is subjective, right?
Well, I kind of felt it kind of worked with the slightly cynical commercialist approach that the gallerist takes to the art world. So I was fine with that. Apart from that, I'm feeling like I'm forgetting something. But nothing's really jumping to mind, but there's definitely something that I'm forgetting.
That's all right. That's
yeah.
I know that's something
that's something I need to do more. I need to think about that more.
Yeah, to sneak some little things in there,
Yeah.
All right. We may have addressed this a little bit, but maybe if we haven't specifically addressed it, Brian Lovejoy asks, as the artist on the game, do you also have a hand in the iconography? So I know we've talked about graphic design. I assume you have at least something to do with it. Are you usually in charge of all the iconography? Do you work with designer?
No, it's usually all me. So it's certainly all me creating the final icons, and sometimes it'll be me saying, okay, we need an icon for this that we don't already have. It really depends on the prototype, but it's definitely me creating all of the icons and the relationships between those, and also taking gameplay elements that might be numeric or have letters or something to represent.
Sure.
Pipeline is a good example. So the pipeline prototype there are 3 levels. There are 4 levels of oil. There's crude, and then low, mid, and high grade oil. And I think, if I remember correctly, that was just A, B, C, D in the prototype. And also then there was lots of numbers on the board. So there was lots of letters and lots of numbers, and it was quite confusing to look at. And the numbers had to be numbers because they were money, right? It was the cost of things. So the obvious thing was to take those A, B, C, D and make them icons,
right?
And things like that. So that kind of, that sort of, again, that comes back to usability and clearing up the visual clutter on the board.
Sure.
That's
another striking cover, is that pipeline cover. All right.
Oh, thank you.
I think I understand this question, but if you're confused by it, then maybe I don't understand it. Gator Dave asks, I'm going to say, Gator, it sounds like a smart question, even if I don't completely understand it, but maybe Ian does. Do you feel that the art representing the components should match the actual physical components or what they represent?
The art... I see. Okay.
Good. I'm glad you see, because I think I understand, but I want to hear what your take is on this.
So I believe what he's saying. So an icon, let's say for wood, in a game, should it look like the piece that you use for wood, or should it look like a block of wood?
Gotcha.
Ideally, both.
Ah, okay.
Would be. That's not always possible.
Sure.
Ideally, both. It depends on what your component is. Would be my if your component is a. I don't know. It's a thematic decision, I would say. There's a fine line. So if your game has 5 generic resources, and they're 5 different colors and they're represented by cubes, and one of them is I don't know. If they're things that aren't your staples in if it's not wood, stone,
right,
brick things. If it's like spices or things that aren't, maybe you don't have as clear an impression of what they are.
Sure.
Then I think you just show a cube. Because it'll save people going, it'll save people doing that mental jump between what does this represent and what does that represent,
right.
Especially when it comes to if you can't quite rely on color with colorblind people and stuff like that. But if it's your wood and your stone and your stuff like that, maybe it's better if it shows a a block of wood or a piece of stone and things like that. But yeah, ideally, at least the shape of the component is the same. So something that does a really good job of this is Marco Polo, where the wood and the gold pieces are the same shape as the icons, but the icons have little embellishments.
Right.
They're kind of illustrated versions of them. So there's no screen printing or anything on the components, but the little camel is the same shape.
Right.
And then on the icon, they've got like a little harness and all that sort of stuff. So it looks, you can look at it and go, oh, that's a camel.
Sure.
So that's a really good balance between the two. But as much as possible, I think an icon, especially a game with a lot of icons. So On Mars was something we did this with. On Mars there's a lot of different shaped wooden pieces. And you wouldn't necessarily know just by look. If I hold it up to you and said, "What's that?" You'd go, "Oh, sure, it's a rover or it's a robot or something like that." But you know, it might not be as clear. It's a little more abstracted because they're wooden pieces. So that's where we made the decision to make the icons represent directly the pieces. So you know, if you know. I found it was more common for players to know that their piece is a rover, and then look around the board saying, "How do I move my rover?" Right, looking around the board, going, "How do I do this?" And if it was an icon that was more abstract, they might not get it. Whereas if it's a little picture of the rover, they get it pretty quick.
Right. Yeah, makes sense. Nice question, Gator. I knew it was a good question. I just had to have Ian, make sure that that I knew what the heck I was talking about. Aaron Schmidtcons asks, what was your most challenging board game design to date?
Clinic.
Oh, okay.
Without a doubt.
What was so challenging about that?
Almost everything. not the publisher. Albin's great. Not the publisher. It took me quite a while to wrap my head around the game. Just the game itself.
Yeah.
It just worked in ways that I just found it very for some reason my brain just didn't mesh with the game.
Sure.
I also, once I started, so that the original, so Clinic is a second, it's deluxe edition, but it's a second edition basically. The original game didn't have a huge amount of iconography.
Okay.
And you had to reference the rule book a lot.
Okay.
Which was no good. So one of the things that I wanted to do is to make the board basically a player aid.
Okay.
And to show you how to play the game. So this is something
there's a little bit of that in Nemo's War too, isn't there? I don't mean to cut you off, but
yeah, definitely. And it's something I also tried to do at Age of Steam as well, just to ease teaching. So you can literally go, okay, this game's played over 1, 2, 3 rounds or phases, and in this phase all your options are here, in this phase all your options are here, and in this phase all your options are here. And then we go to here, and then we go to scoring, and then we go back to the start and we do it again, right? If you can illustrate that on the board, that really helps with the teaching experience.
Right.
And also with making sure you don't forget things, because you're going through a checklist. So without really knowing what I was getting into, I started into a process of, well, how do I take all these conventions and make them work with iconography? And that was just an incredibly difficult task.
Sure.
Because Albin's games, or at least Clinic, I think Clinic is one of his most complex games.
I believe so, yeah.
So Clinic has a lot of different rules for different things, right? So it's not a case where if you build, you always do this.
Right.
It's if you're building this module, you have to do this, and if you're building this module, you have to do that. But if you're building a parking lot, you have to do that. But if it's on the second floor, you have to do that. And so there's all these different things. And I just, in order to come up with a system of iconography that works for all of them, I just wrapped my head in circles.
Right.
So Nathan Morse is the rulebook editor. And he's also very, very familiar with the game, more familiar than I am.
Mm-hmm.
So I spent hours on Skype calls with him, going through the board and the player aids and things like that, just trying to unwrap it, just kind of going, okay. Because when you look at iconography, the thing that you have to look for is, does this work when I know what it means?
Mm-hmm.
And that's great, but also, what could it mean if I didn't know what it means?
Right.
How could we misinterpret this?
Right.
What else could it mean? And when you've got this sort of complex web of possible explanations, and yes, it means this, but it doesn't mean that when you're doing this, but then if that doesn't mean that, does this other thing also not mean that?
Right.
Or when does it and when anyway, that was very.
It sounds like it was a little bit challenging, of course.
Yeah.
But I was going to say, generally happy with how it all turned out, I assume?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm still getting over it a little bit. So
gotcha.
It's distance.
Well, we were coming up on the 10 o'clock hour. Let's have one more. I think this is a fun little question from Cora Lou. What is the best meeple you have designed?
Oh, wow. I really like designing meeples.
I would imagine that would be fun.
It's really easy and it's really quick, and you're just working with silhouettes and shapes and things like that. What is the best meeple? I don't know. I really like. I did a pair of passenger meeples for Stevenson's Rocket, which I really like.
They're
kind of like,
is it? I want to say Grail Games. Is that right? Or
yeah, the Grail Knizia game. That was a really fun game to do, actually. There's a pair of passenger meeples, and they're kind of in their old Victorian outfits. One of them's got a number out. So I quite like those. As a pair, they look quite good. They stand together, they look quite good. I've done lots of fun ones for Vital's games.
Yeah, there were a lot in On Mars. You had tons of.
Yeah. The little robots I quite like. I like, they're not meeples, but I like the little plastic spaceships and robots from Black Angel. I think they turned out really. And the Black Angel itself turned out quite nice.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a really fun exercise designing meeples. I like it.
I can imagine.
I do sometimes run up against how many ways can I.
Right.
How many ways can I make a person holding a clipboard in yeah.
That would be true. All right. Well, it's been lovely. I do apologize for any audio issues if there were. They're all on my end. I tried to work with the gain a little bit, but hopefully it wasn't too distracting. Ian, I really, really appreciate you coming on. It's always really, really interesting to me because I've been on record. I call myself a shallow gamer, but I don't know that does enough credit because I'm a sucker for the aesthetics, and so I definitely appreciate what you do. You're one of my favorite in the biz, and it's always nice to kind of hear what your end of things are. So I appreciate you coming on and interacting with the chat and just being a lovely gentleman.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, thank you to the chat as always. I am a bad host and I forgot to see who's going to be on this tomorrow, but one of the fantastic Dice Tower peeps will be on here running this show tomorrow. And so I'm sure it'll be great. And I hope all of you are back. And Ian, thanks again. And I hope we get to talk again soon.
Cheers, Mike.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.